For today comes from Psalm 20. Hear now the word of the Lord. The Lord answer you in the day of trouble. The name of the God of Jacob protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and give you support from Zion. May he remember all your offerings and regard with favor your burnt sacrifices. May he grant you your heart's desire and fulfill your plans, all your plans. May we shout for joy over your victory, and in the name of our God set up our banners. May the Lord fulfill all your petitions. Now I know that the Lord will help his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven with mighty victories by his right hand. Some take pride in chariots and some in horses, but our pride is in the name of the Lord our God. They will collapse and fall, but we shall rise and stand upright. Give victory to the King, O Lord. Answer us when we call.
Our New Testament text is the Second Timothy, second chapter, verses 1 through 7. Hear God's word. You then, my child, be strong in the grace that is in Jesus Christ. And what you have heard from me through many witnesses, entrust to faithful people who will be able to teach others as well. Share in suffering like a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No one serving in the army gets entangled in everyday affairs. The soldier's aim is to please the enlisting officer. Is that true, Paul? I don't know. Okay. Back then it certainly was. And in the case of the athlete, no one is crowned without competing according to the rules. It is the farmer who does the work, who ought to have the first share of the crops. Think over what I say, for the Lord will give you understanding of all things. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
100 years ago today, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, fighting in World War I came to an end. Kaiser Wilhelm had abdicated his crown on the previous day, and the new government in Germany, eager for peace, immediately signed an armistice agreement with the Allies. Today, on the 100th anniversary of the end of the fighting of World War I, we remember more than 16 million people who lost their lives during that conflict. Unfortunately, this war to end all wars was not to be the last. Many more have sprung up around the world over the last 100 years. Conflicts, even today, never seem to cease. And sadly, Cameroon is one of those places where persecution and prejudice and violence has reared its ugly head. Just 4 days ago, the stated clerk of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA, the Reverend Dr. J. Herbert Nelson III, sent out a letter to all the churches in the denomination, which I believe is appropriate for me to read this morning. The letter goes like this. Sisters and brothers, I urgently call you to prayer for our partners and friends in Cameroon, a nation still wrestling with the impact of past division by colonial powers into French-speaking and English-speaking regions. Concerns among English-speaking citizens that they are treated as second-class citizens in this majority French-speaking nation have spawned separatist movements. Clashes between separatists and government forces have left many dead. Most recently, a group of armed men entered the campus of the Presbyterian Secondary School at Nkwen Barmenda and abducted 78 students and 3 staff members, according to a statement by the Right Reverend Samuel Fonke, moderator of the Presbyterian Church of Cameroon. We rejoice in the release of the students less than 24 hours after their abduction, but continue to pray for the staff. For over The past 2 years, the government, intending to quell the political protests, have closed down a number of businesses and shut down the internet access in the 2 English-speaking provinces in an effort to quell the political protests. In addition, church hospitals have been vandalized. 7 of the Presbyterian Church in Cameroon's health centers have been rendered non-functional, and doctors and nurses are afraid to work. Nearly 2/3 of the church's 223 schools were closed for the last academic year, and 128 parishes have been unable to operate normally. In October of last year, the Presbyterian Church in Cameroon issued a statement that opened with a prophetic call to peace. Quote, "At a time when fear and uncertainty are looming in the air, as a time when emotions have taken over reason, at a time when the sacredness of human life has been defiled, at a time when we are creating more enemies than friends, at a time when division seems to be destroying the unity of our people, and at a time when we do not seem to trust each other, we are here again to remind all Presbyterians and the people of Cameroon of our collective responsibility and role as the church and as a people in these trying moments in our nation's history. Our sisters and brothers of the Cameroon Church of Cameroon stand in the vanguard of the efforts to calm the situation and create the possibility for peace across this valuable nation. It is incumbent upon all of us to lift our voices to God in prayer, calling for calm among all the parties and asking God to shape the will of those in authority to seek peaceful and just solutions to the escalating conflict. We also encourage U.S. officials to take leadership in helping to find a diplomatic solution to the current crisis. Reverend Nelson continues by saying, please consider writing or calling Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to thank him for the State Department's call for peaceful dialogue and unhindered access to humanitarian aid workers. Ask him to continue to monitor the situation and work for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. In the name of the one who is the Prince of Peace, the Reverend Dr. J. Herbert Nelson, Stated Clerk of the General Assembly, Presbyterian Church, USA. I think it's appropriate on this Veterans Day, as we celebrate and honor all those who have worked for peace, to remember the nation of Cameroon in our prayers. Today is Veterans Day, a day we honor all those who've served in the military, either foreign or domestic. It was first called Armistice Day and was originally set aside as a day to remember the sacrifices made by just the men and women who served in World War I. But in 1953, Congress changed that name to Veterans Day to honor all veterans. Veterans Day is really about gratitude and stewardship. On Veterans Day, we proclaim our gratitude to those whose service in the military has secured our freedoms through the years. Whether or not we approve or not of our nation's foreign policy, we need to support the everyday people, mostly working class, often minority, who fight our nation's wars. We need to say thank you. But our thanksgiving should also lead to action, both in support of the well-being of veterans, especially those who have been injured or traumatized by war, and in our own commitment to the common good and our nation's care for its most vulnerable citizens, those for whom our soldiers sacrificed. We also need to remember, as we have done this morning, to honor and thank those families who have stood by their soldiers, spouses, parents, grandparents, friends, who have sacrificed while their loved ones were overseas. These people have prayed many prayers, asking God to protect their loved ones when they went off to conflict. Many had to go the extra mile to take care of their family and to support the community while their spouse was performing their duty. Now, all that aside, I have to tell you that I hate war. I don't hate soldiers, and I don't hate sailors. I have two sailors in my family, Austin and Danielle. They serve in the Navy. My father and my father-in-law both served in the Navy. My brother was a Marine. What I believe is that engaging in armed conflict goes against the teaching of Jesus. Still, I respect the fact that war veterans have made incredible sacrifices for causes they believed to be noble, and sometimes not so noble. I'm also in favor of cutting military spending. I think instead we should increase spending on the medical and psychological care for our veterans. The high rates of mental illness, divorce, and suicide among military veterans is alarming. In the United States, a large number of veterans who fought in wars have returned from them and from the battlefield to a life of poverty and inadequate social services. Consider for a moment these statistics from the Center for American Progress. Nearly 1 in 7 homeless adults are veterans. 1.5 million veterans are at risk of homelessness due to poverty, lack of support networks, dismal living conditions, and overcrowded or substandard housing. An average of 20 veterans a day commit suicide. And this is really appalling. 307,000 vets have died waiting care from the VA. Given these statistics, it's not hard to conclude that many of our country's most brave and courageous men and women have been politically shortchanged and done a shameful disservice. Instead of being honored and cared for, they have been funneled into the country's growing impoverished and working poor masses that are forced to take jobs with long hours, very low pay, and very little opportunity for advancement. It is an American tragedy that many of those who have fought to protect the power and prosperity of our nation are rewarded with a life that affords them little access to either. This is even more appalling when you realize, and I got this on the internet, and I don't know who wrote it, but I think it's appropriate here. It's the veteran, not the reporter, who gives us freedom of the press. It's the veteran, not the poet, who has given us freedom of speech. It's the veteran, not the campus organizer, who has given us freedom to assemble. It's the veteran, not the politician, who has given us the right to vote. It's the veteran, not the lawyer, who has given us the right to a fair trial. And it's the veteran, not the preacher, who has given us freedom of religion. Truth is, today our lives are pretty cushy. And apart from 9/11 and a couple of isolated terrorist attacks on our soil, we are far removed from the troubled spots of the world. We have to read history to remind ourselves that a lot of blood was spilled here in the United States by our forefathers to get us the liberties and luxuries we enjoy. We haven't had a war on American soil since the Civil War over 150 years ago. In today's global society, we send our troops far away. And while Christians should stand against the terrible violence and toil of war, we aren't innocent victims in all of this, not by any means. In the 2,000 years since the birth of Christ, it's hard to find a war that wasn't fought over religion, that didn't invoke religion on one or both sides, that didn't represent people trying to pull God into their human disputes. There's hardly been a period in Christian history without a Christian war going on somewhere, Christians against Muslims, Catholics against Protestants, Protestants against Protestants. And if the war didn't directly was not directly caused over religion, religion was often invoked, often on both sides. Think of the Civil War, with famously pious generals, mostly Protestants, on both sides praying for God to give them the strength to kill each other, and thanking God afterwards for giving them the victory. All this involves some basic human presumptions, none of them consistent with the teachings of Christ. The presumption that God would approve of war, the presumption that God would take sides in a war, the presumption that God would want to get involved in such human stupidity at all. Now, certainly we read in the Old Testament of wars and rumors of war and God participating. But if we read in the Old Testament about Moses coming down from the mountain with the Ten Commandments, one of the most important being, thou shalt not kill. Not thou shalt not kill Christians, not thou shalt not kill only the good guys, but thou shalt not kill, pure and simple. And in the New Testament, the life of Christ seems to be the ultimate pacifist. If you read the Beatitudes, what do you think? Do you think Christ would say it was okay to kill members of another faith or members of no faith? The teachings of Christ, the very essence of Christianity, tell us that killing is a sin. And despite 2,000 years of human effort to the contrary, there is no justification in the story of Christ for killing one another. There's a popular African proverb that says, when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. Proverb highlights the reality that too often when nations and powerful entities fight among themselves, the common people of the land suffer the most. It's a historical truth that those who make the decisions to wage wars, military, legislative, or otherwise, often have the least to lose. Sure, they may lose their prestige, their position or power, but in the end, their essential well-being and access to basic necessities are maintained. Sadly, the same cannot be said of those who are the instruments and casualties of war and political conflict. One thing ties all wars together. They tend to be declared by old people, our politicians, and fought by young people. Read somewhere this one guy had this brilliant idea. This is what he said. He said that wars are always fought by young men, but why? Young men think they'll never die. They think that war might be an adventure. And he suggested instead we should send our old people. Think about it. Old people would be less cooperative. Picture World War I scene. Troops in the trenches. Officer shouts, "Over the top, boys, charge!" Troops in the trenches, now all about 65 or over, say, "You know, my back's a little stiff today. It's not really a good day for a charge. Maybe tomorrow." They're also more likely to argue, "Well, why should we charge? I mean, they got machine guns. It's dangerous, not to mention pointless." He says this idea could be the end of warfare at long last. Then there's this other idea. When Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, he received a letter from 8-year-old Keith Atkin of Trumbull, Connecticut. And Keith wrote, he says, "After listening to the news about the Cold War, I'm worried about the people in the world. And thinking it over, I got a plan. Get all the leaders together who want war. Put them in a ring and let them fight it out. Maybe we should just let those who want to fight do the fighting. Don't involve anybody else in it." So on this Veterans Day, certainly let us be grateful But let our gratitude inspire us to generosity and commitment to the well-being of our nation, and most importantly, to its most vulnerable citizens and veterans who suffer the ravages of war. For we are invited never to forget that really the two great commandments, the commandments that matter the most, are that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, might, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourself. Maybe that should be the end of it. Amen. Invite you now.